Well, we brought together Linda Bauld and Peter Hitchens. She is the Professor of Public Health at Edinburgh University who backs targeted restrictions. He is the Mail on Sunday columnist who hates the idea of those new marshals. We asked them to debate what's lost and what's gained.
It makes me feel very dispirited. Again and again, week by week, the pleasure and freedom of normal life is being narrowed by state interference in things where the state has no business. And as we all know, if you give people power, they will invariably abuse it. And the idea of more people with power to boss us around being sent out onto the streets is, as I say, profoundly dispiriting.
So you don't see this as a sort of benign public health parky telling us to rent a deck chair and get off the grass. You see this as an assault on Peter Hitchens' liberty, a COVID marshal?
Not necessarily on mine. I think the intentions are plainly benign. I don't doubt that the people involved in doing this think that they're doing good. But that's the worst of it. People who think they're doing good are often the ones who make the worst mistakes and do the most damage.
Professor Bauld, you gave evidence to the Scottish Government this week about a house party of 300 people where laws were not enough to prevent a public health disaster.
No, that's right. And the laws do differ in different parts of the obviously devolved nations of the UK. But I think the concern about that house party, particularly at a time when cases were rising in Scotland, is that there are powers to issue relatively small fines or warnings to people who attend. But my concern was with those who'd organised it, because there wouldn't have been a big party without somebody organising it and profiting from it. And they were not able to be pursued or be given a fixed penalty notice in the same way that is the case in England. So we had a useful discussion in the committee about these divergences and whether we need to think carefully about those kinds of penalties, right, particularly for people who organise such events.
So someone had laid on a house party in Scotland for 300 people inside and really nothing could be done about it.
Well, they can be pursued through the normal routes of the law, but I think the issue with the coronavirus restrictions is we need things to work very rapidly, and they'd rented this house specifically for that purpose.
Right. And what is the public health impact of a party for 300 people indoors?
So we know that indoor environments are more risky. I'm pretty confident there wouldn't have been any physical distancing or face coverings in that kind of environment. They're basically not permitted, those types of events at the moment, because we don't want to give opportunities for the virus to spread.
Peter, you, I bet, feel that's irresponsible.
I'm not particularly keen on house parties with 300 people or any number of people, and I'm not here to defend those. But the argument against them is not anything much to do with the spreading of disease, in my view. The whole argument we should be having here is one of proportion. We have had an outbreak of a disease in this country. It's been quite serious, but not that exceptional. The government's response to it has been, from the start, wholly out of proportion to the size of the problem. There is very little evidence that the actions that have been taken over the past 6 months have done the slightest good. And this continues to be the case. And now, with the famous rule of 6 announced at the end of last week, we have the government effectively making normal life illegal. 2,500 years ago, the playwright Aeschylus was wandering about near his home in Sicily when an eagle dropped a tortoise on his head. Now, it's been 2,500 years since that happened, so I suppose it's quite likely it'll happen again soon. But it would be wholly disproportionate to urge everybody to wear tortoise helmets or to persuade the whole of the British public to grease their tortoises so eagles couldn't pick them up. The risk is simply too small to justify.
We've gone back much further than I thought we would. Professor Bauld, I think you would like to address the factual argument that Peter Hitchens is making. Do you agree with him? There is no factual evidence that lockdown measures have proved to clamp down on the virus.
Oh, no, I disagree with that. I think what Peter's saying is the virus is spreading again, which is the case. But what we did over the summer months through lockdown measures and in the spring was suppress the virus. So we got case numbers down to a low level. And in the beginning, let's be frank, very few countries knew what they were doing. And they had to restrict movement because they didn't want to overwhelm their health services. But also, I mean, I work in public health. My preference would be that we preserve life and that we avoid preventable deaths. And the 60,000 plus deaths we've had in the UK, not all of them would have been preventable, but a good proportion of them were, and that's a tragedy.
So on Peter's point about where's the balance, do you agree that there is a loss of liberty in order to save life? Are you worried about the loss of liberties in the way that Peter is?
I have some sympathy for that because I am worried about the duration of restrictions that are applying to people and how long people are willing to comply with it. And we've already seen a divergence of views in those who are not happy with it. But we have to strike a balance because we don't have a vaccine and we don't have highly effective treatments. All we can do at the moment is use public health measures. And to avoid people gathering, mixing and spreading the virus, there are restrictions that are required. So yes, it is a choice between absolute liberty and the preservation of health and life. And that's tricky, but that's where we are.
Peter, do you worry how your comments will land with listeners who've lost people to the virus? There have been preventable deaths. We could argue over the figure, and that's all we ever do in Britain now anyway, argue about everything. But to listeners who've lost people, do you come over as slapdash?
Well, I should hope not. I've never said anything to suggest that I don't regret the death of anybody. I'm very much of the John Donne persuasion. Every man's death diminishes me, and I grieve at every death, and particularly one grieves at avoidable deaths. But I do not believe that the measures taken have avoided deaths. It's all very well to switch the discussion to the number of cases, which the advocates of increased strangling of the economy and increased interference in private life do. But these cases are in many cases not cases. They're positive tests, which may or may not be correct, of people who are in most cases, I think probably 80% of cases, asymptomatic, and in many other cases certainly not seriously enough ill to go to hospital.
Okay.
The crucial figure of deaths began to fall on the 8th of April in this country, has been falling ever since, is extremely low. The number of hospitalizations is extremely low, but the government, having exaggerated the danger from the beginning, continues to claim that the danger is very great because it can't admit that it made a grave mistake.
I think the reason we're now focusing on cases to some extent is because we have now learned the hard way how to protect the disaster that happened in nursing homes, keep COVID and non-COVID cases separate in hospital. But if you do look at the data, the hospital admissions are drifting up. What you see around the world is as cases rise, 3 to 4 weeks later, sure enough, and this is what France is experiencing, ICU admissions rise. Okay. Even though most people who get the virus now are young and won't be badly affected, when they went back in Italy to see the people who were hospitalized, follow them up after 6 months, 50% of them, and including younger people, were still having longer term effects. So there's a lot we don't know about this disease. We don't want anyone to get it.
Professor, if you saw people in your street breaking the rules, would you report them to the police?
No, so I absolutely don't agree with finger wagging. I think the enforcement and the regulations have to be for exceptional cases, and that's why there's penalties associated with that. The rest of the time, I would agree with what the police try and do, which is the 4 E's. And so they're talking about engage, explain, and encourage. Those are the first 3. The enforce is the last resort.
And to you, Peter Hitchens, you don't like the rules. Would you break them?
No, I'm not advocating the breaking of rules, and I try very hard to abide by the rule of law. But the problem with what's happening at the moment is it's stretching law. Quite possibly all these laws are based on a misinterpretation and misuse of the 1984 Public Health Act, which was never designed to provide powers of the kind which the government is now exercising by decree. And I think the problem is if governments, which have previously relied on parliamentary making of law, start ruling by decree and extending law deep into people's private lives, they undermine the rule of law because they make it impossible, even for the best intentioned and law-abiding people, to keep it. And that is the end of the rule of law once you do that.
The views of Peter Hitchens and of Professor Linda Bauld, with thanks to both.